Welcome to the Crypto Compliance Podcast by Gatenox.
Hello, Paweł, Kuskowski, welcoming Crypto Compliance by Gatenox, where compliance experts and practitioners are talking about current market events and general compliance aspects. We promote the highest compliance standards in crypto, bringing interesting topics and talk about practical issues. I would like to ask you to subscribe to our channel, leave your comments and share it. Let's together promote compliance culture in crypto and Web3. Please also check our website, gatenox.com. Gatenox is the fast network and tailored corporate KYC solution. With Gatenox, you can onboard corporate clients by working in a trusted and compliant ecosystem with Web3 capabilities. Today, we have a special episode with Karol van Cleef talking about the US regulatory landscape after the recent US Security Exchange Commission actions. We spoke about SEC versus Binance case, Coinbase, Binance assets freeze, and if crypto NFT space is becoming simply too risky to do business in, because you will never know what will happen in 5 years' time with interpretation of law and whether you are actually in breach of law or not, regardless which jurisdiction you are in, under which law you actually issuing your token, NFT, or where you operate. Stay tuned. Thank you. Hi, Karol. How are you?
I'm great. I think you're the one who's had the excitement this week being in Amsterdam.
Yeah, Money 2020 is active, and definitely interesting spot. But I think, everyone in Amsterdam was talking about what's going to happen with crypto, Web3, and, what does it mean, what's happening in the US for the entire ecosystem, entire industry. We had meetings with venture capital, which were saying, okay, we are at the moment, we are not investing in this space until we have some clarification. So, explain to us, Karol, what's your view about, first the SEC submitting the complaint on Binance and then, starting with Coinbase again, which, from my perspective, I understand, Binance, this is something that we knew coming, it was coming, but, what's happening with Coinbase? And, so let's start with Binance. What's your view?
Can I actually take a step back and say that the last 7 days have been just jam-packed with developments? And it really started, I think, in my mind, last Friday when the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, which is probably the most influential committee on these issues in the U.S. Congress, released a draft draft piece of legislation to address just the issues that we've been talking about the rest of the week. And then, Monday morning we wake up to, at least East Coast time, to the SEC taking action against Coinbase, against Binance. And then if that wasn't enough, because that was a 167-page court filing complaint that was filed against Binance. Within 24 hours, they then filed a similar kind of complaint, not identical in some very important ways, against Coinbase. And then on top of that, on Tuesday night, the SEC made another filing in the courts to freeze Binance's assets, which was another, on top of the 100+ page document from Coinbase, we now had another 67-page document. So we've had a lot to just plain digest in terms of paper this week.
So Karol, on this point, so just in sequence, so we have proposed draft legislation, right, which would basically address majority of the issues, which pan out later on. And then we have SEC issuing complaints, right? So that's kind of the sequence, right? And going after majority of the market, let's say.
Right. And let me, again, starting with the legislation is much more narrow than some of the legislation we saw last year. It's really focused on the set of issues and not necessarily all of the issues that are on the table with the SEC actions against Binance and Coinbase. But it's the first start of new leadership in the House to deal with these issues. So it's an important starting place, and it also has a lot of support from the crypto ecosphere, which is very important as this conversation moves along. And the member of Congress who introduced the legislation, Patrick McHenry, has been very sympathetic to the issues that really came to a head on Monday and Tuesday with the SEC filings. So that's sort of setting the scene, is that, if you were in the crypto space before 8 a.m. on Monday morning, you were starting to feel pretty good, because now we've got a piece of legislation, we've got an influential member of Congress that's ready to move it, and we're making progress, and then all of a sudden, wham.
Yeah, and I think this is exactly what was discussed, and right now crypto world around the world. So I spoke with some guys in Singapore this morning, in Europe this morning, and everyone was okay. We don't know what's going to happen. It's actually really, really bad for the industry and all this stuff. And like. Funny enough, we both know that most of this was coming, right? We saw this coming for a while. We also pointed out that there is a number of conversations which, like we cannot hide, against the regulations. We cannot try to find the jurisdiction which is most friendly, friendly in this way, around the world and operate globally. So that's something that it's definitely negative impact. But we also spoke, Carol, before this recording, that you said that it's not going to be that bad. So why do you think so?
Well, I don't know if I'll say it's not going to be that bad, but and I did say that. As you said, all of this has been telegraphed before. We've pretty much known what the scope of the issues are going to be. We've known that both of the entities have been under a great deal of scrutiny. In the case of Coinbase, their issues have been pretty much centralized with the SEC of late. With Binance, that's a much bigger issue. And, we have to read through these documents very carefully. As soon as the Binance action was filed on Monday morning, I tweeted out almost instantly, "Where's the Department of Justice and FinCEN?" Because that's, I think, the really biggest shoe that we're waiting to see dropped here. It's been rumored for a very long time, and there is a reference in one of the SEC filings to the fact that the Department of Justice has been investigating. It's been reported that the Department of Justice has been investigating Binance, and that whatever happens in that case is going to probably be more fundamentally altering to Binance's operations and its path forward than what's going to happen with Coinbase. Yeah. I felt, especially with Coinbase over the last few months, as the rhetoric has been intensifying, and that's really what it's been. It's been rhetoric between Coinbase and the SEC about whether, to what extent Coinbase's operations should come under the securities umbrella. I felt it's like a game of chicken where you've got two people and two cars speeding at each other at 100 miles an hour, and the question is who's going to blink first. And I think,
I think you have a truck. You have big truck on one side, and like simple car on the other side.
Well, you had a pretty good ego on the other side, right, that thought he was driving a pretty big car, and I think that's part of the realization here, is that maybe that car wasn't so big. Maybe it wasn't the equivalent of the truck coming in the other direction. I also think that there was a lot of optimism on the part of the crypto space that these issues would be resolved. We'd have legislation that would provide a path forward so that we wouldn't get to this moment. The bottom line is, we don't have that legislation. We have a set of laws in the U.S. It's been telegraphed for quite a while now, really 5 plus 6 years now almost, that these laws do apply. We've just hit the day of reckoning. We've hit that day when the cars speeding at each other just did the wham.
And I saw many comments on, the SEC complaint for Binance is that, it's clear that it's security law violation. And there's interestingly, so there's obviously, if SEC is issuing this type of document, right, the main majority would be around securities law, right? Interestingly, there's a lot of AML, anti-money laundering, reference in the document, in the Binance one, especially around corporate structure, which is very close to Gatenox Hub, but it's definitely something that we know this very well, but kind of this, structuring the companies in a different way. So it's very difficult to find out where is the true ownership, all the structure. That's clear. And that's from page, I think, number 9, down, several pages. We have description of the structure. We have the description of how CZ is actually owning all the companies through this structure. So that's interesting because this should be actually in the space of FinCEN, right? This should be more into the FinCEN area as opposed to SEC.
Well, I think there are a couple of different issues going on here. So there is there are those sets of issues around Binance and its structure and how it may have obfuscated its activities, not just in the U.S. but globally. And to your point, a lot of pieces to be figured out of who owns what. But there's another set of issues that are KYC or related that are covered in this order. And it's a very subtle point. And I'll try and trying to explain it as clearly as I can. But bottom line is that there are a lot of allegations, very similar to what was in the CFTC's complaint a couple of months ago against Binance, is that it wasn't doing enough with respect to its customers, knowing who they are. And why it's important in particular in this complaint is to establish the fact that they were doing business with U.S. residents. And in some cases, they were doing enough that they knew they were doing business with U.S. residents, but they weren't taking the steps to comply with U.S. law appropriately. It's they're taking off the table. You can't tell us. You can't come in and argue against all the paperwork we've just laid on you and say, oh, you can't do this to us because we weren't doing business with U.S. residents. What the SEC was trying to say is, you had enough in front of you that you knew you were doing business. There's a second very important piece to this, is that if the SEC is correct and wins its case that that Binance has been operating in an not being appropriately registered, it then opens the door to all sorts of anti-money laundering or Bank Secrecy Act violations. Because if they were supposed to be registered as a broker dealer, in the different kinds of categories that they were supposed to be, they had very clear obligations to do KYC, to do certain of the requirements around anti-money laundering compliance. And the fact is that they weren't doing it. And so you've got a sort of a gotcha big time violation of law that can be put on the table.
Okay, but why SEC is kind of pointing out that the violation of AML laws? It shouldn't be just focusing on the security law, or like. Well,
that's a very good question. Part of wanting appropriately compliant entities is that they're doing everything that they should be doing. And the SEC is responsible for our Bank Secrecy Act compliance laws in the securities industry. So it's very much within their jurisdiction, and it becomes a very clear violation of law, which gives them if you can walk in and say you're in violation of this law has penalties of lots of fines and going to jail. you're going to get the other side to start to negotiate with you more seriously, more rapidly than you would otherwise.
Yeah.
There's a similar kind of issue is set up in the case that CFTC brought against Binance, but it's a big stick. It's a very big stick when it comes time to sort of negotiating the final aspects of, and also the amount of the fine that's going to have to be paid.
Okay, and then we have, the second part which you mentioned is the assets freeze, right? This is and it's kind of linked together. These two aspects are linked together. And in order to violate the security law, Binance would have to trade securities, right? So this is now we are coming to the token side, right? Which is like, okay, now we say these are securities, hence you are trading securities, right? If we say that these are not securities, and there's like, I think, Solana and a couple of others are mentioned, which obviously for many, many, many years been saying that they are not securities. And this is only, most recent development when we have, the shift of, let's say, definition, but it's actually they are securities. And this is why you need to be under the securities law. So that's something, what's your view on the securities aspect? And, like another point to this is, how many lawyers are in troubles because of the, advising, but, we have so many like, Coolies, DLA Piper, all this stuff, we can name them, all the way. Everyone was advising, that it's the Huey, test is actually not applicable here.
So I thought when you were bringing up the lawyer word, it was going to be in a slightly different context, because what I was about to say is that, one thing for certain is there's a lot of lawyers who've been very busy this week. I think in a lot of ways, the biggest impact of these filings, you've got two companies that are in a world of hurt. They are very important companies for the infrastructure of crypto. Yeah. But, I think equally as important, if not longer term implications, are these projects. And there were 26 of them that ultimately have been listed over the last several weeks. In several, and there was one other case filed a couple of weeks ago, and we now have some of the biggest names that in the space. And to be honest with you, these are the names that there are several ICO projects from the 2017-18 timeframe that have already sort of made their peace with the SEC. They signed the papers. They are done whatever they said they're going to do. They've had certain recognitions of it, EOS, Tezos, and so on, are a few examples. But, you have to say, you look at all the other projects that came out, maybe some of them through the same law firms that the other projects came out through. But these projects were, you say, where's the SEC been on all of this? Are they going to equally enforce the law across all of these projects? Are they going to take the same perspective? I think that question was answered in a major way this week. When we saw
what's the answer?
You mean in terms of, what's next?
20,000 ICOs, token issuance, one way or another, right? In last 5-6 years. Is it going to be all of them going to be subpoena at some point, you think? Or what is the...
I've taken the view. I've been very consistent on the record that that we're likely to see all of them touched at some point along the way. I mean, a lot of them don't even exist anymore. Yeah. And to be very honest, in my mind, those are the ones that we really want to get under paper. We want an SEC enforcement action, and so the people who are behind those projects are held accountable. Because I think that's the real issue, that a lot of these projects came to the table, with minimal disclosure, virtually no level of accountability. They took the money and a lot of them ran.
Yeah.
A lot of them had a good time for a period of time until the money was spent. A lot of them raised money right at the height of the price of Bitcoin back in 2017. And by the time you got to the end of 18, early 19, what they had raised was a small fraction of what the value of what they raised was a small fraction of what they had raised at the time. Because if you look at the value of ETH, the way it had fallen in that time period, and a lot of them did take an ETH as their money. So are we going to see all 20,000? Well, we certainly have seen 20 of the biggest ones that are now having to explain more. We do know over the years that subpoenas have gone out to these projects, that Wells notices have gone out. We've had different levels of interaction with the SEC. My guess is for a number of these projects, the SEC is probably sitting on waivers of statute of limitations, though there's an argument if they're continuing to trade on an ongoing basis that the statute of limitations may not have run. So it's a pretty complicated world. We're going to be at this for, I think, a long time. As I said, a lot of lawyers are going to be employed. It's been very interesting watching Twitter this week because one project after another has come out with I was reading last night, Filecoin tweeted out a very long piece about how it's not a security and the rationale behind it, the steps that they took to make sure that they, and that they weren't violating the securities laws. So that actually raises one really important point, is that some of these may be securities or may have been securities at the time that they were issued, which is an ongoing debate. Can you change your stripes from being a security at the time of issuance to coming out at a later time when there's wider adoption? And what they tried to do over the years, as you well know, is that they tried to structure their initial release of the coins in a way that was compliant with U.S. law. They only sold to accredited investors. They only sold to foreigners. Where it gets messy is once the coins start to trade on public exchanges, trade publicly. That's when we start to delve into a new world.
But on this point, isn't it like we in Gatenox, we're thinking about NFT as you may know, and is it like the risk right now to do anything which is touching crypto in one way or another, including NFT? Because at the point of issuance, you are clear that it's not some, let's say security, but then you don't know, right? And it could be that you issued something that SEC would come some years later to say, well, that's effectively a security, and it's killing your project. It's you're risking your personal life, all this stuff. So there's huge impact, coming out of this. And there's many lawyers who are advising, no, it's not securities. This is not how you. I know that it doesn't cover your bases if you take lawyers to write, opinion on certain aspects, right? But then you have to be able to rely on certain understanding of law, right?
You've packed a lot into your comment there.
The basis is, would that impact right now crypto world to the extent that, anything which you do around crypto bears a risk that it's going to be either risky immediately to the project that you're running, or it's going to be, in 5 years time, someone could change the definition that would say that, NFT is actually, even if you connect this to, I don't know, painting or digital painting, right? You suddenly are in breach of security law because that's not digital representation of rights attached to the painting. It's actually security, and it should be traded only on the regulated exchange and all this stuff. So suddenly you have too much risk, and I wonder what's going to be with the likes of what's the Starbucks, and this type of projects. When is there any risk for them?
Well, so yesterday, the former chairman of the SEC did an interview, I think, on Bloomberg. Hopefully, I've got the right outlet. A question like this was posed to him. And what he immediately went to was Taylor Swift. And you probably have followed Taylor Swift has been doing, I think it's a global tour, but certainly a U.S. tour with sales of tickets through the roof and the aftermarket that is even higher. And I've watched it. My daughter bought some tickets at $200, and almost instantly she could have sold them for.
Did she buy it on the regulated exchange? Because that's probably security.
But it's not, and that's what his comment was. Tickets. A sale of a ticket.
Listen, the whole Huey test was around membership, right? This is where it started. So it's type of VIP. It's like it's I don't know, 1 hour membership to access VIP area, right? That's membership. You have profits, so that's security. You can structure this.
Let's back up. Don't get so far ahead here. So let's stay on Taylor Swift for a minute. That Taylor Swift, when she sells a ticket, she's selling something, shall we say real? She's selling something. While it may be an electronic ticket, it's still a tangible something that's going to give somebody that's buying that ticket the ability to walk into a concert. And we've sold tickets for years and years and years in this country and around the world. Are those securities? No. Are they commodities? Probably that's the right category for them. I mean, I should say all securities are commodities as well. So
now we have CFTC involved, or what's going to be?
Well, that's where I'm going. So bear with me. Is that what's different in the world that we live in now is that if I bought a Taylor Swift ticket and I wanted to sell it to you, we could do it at a person-to-person transaction. Over the years, that resale market has become more sophisticated and it has become electronic. When you move into the electronic world, you're bringing forth a whole bunch of new sort of powers around it and new risk. And I think that's part of what our laws are trying to adjust for, are those risks. So the way I would potentially see it is with the Taylor Swift ticket. It's much like a pork belly contract, for example, a right to buy a pork belly or a certain amount of pork bellies in the future. And that's something that when it starts to trade, it's trading on a commodities exchange, and it would be regulated like that. So I think eventually, the ticket markets, a lot of the NFT exchange markets are going to be, at least overseen by the CFT or somebody that has a similar level of jurisdiction. Now, what do they look for right now? It's just looking for market manipulation, looking for evidence of fraud. So it's making sure that people are playing fair in the game that they're playing. So going back to the whole sort of securities issue and when do we cross the line? We've always been very functionally oriented in the United States, looking at what the function is. And with respect to the Howey test that you've been referencing, which is, the crypto space loves to go back and say this is from a Supreme Court case in 1946. It's 80 years, almost 80 years old. How can that be relevant in this day and age? But it did set out a number of good points to think through when you start to consider the relationship of different parties. So the SEC in 2019 put out a multi-page document to guidance on the factors that they would consider around the Howey test. And it's a very good document. It lists out 15 or 16 different factors, and within each factor, there are multiple issues that they will consider. But it's a good guide in looking at a project and saying, hey, is this more like a security or not a security? And the problem is these are very factually intensive analyses. And it's sort of like taking a scale. You've got two sides of the scale, and you put certain facts on one side and certain facts on the other side, and the question is which side's going to weigh down the other side. And when you look through the orders of or the two complaints that have been filed this week, and Binance and Coinbase, when they go through each one of the coins and the ICOs that were done or associated with them, they are putting out a bunch of those factors that they're going to put on their side that's going to weigh more heavily for it to be a security. So I sort of, there's a lot of thought that goes into this, but it's also not rocket science. And I think that people have tried this. There's been a lot of denial that, oh, well, we're not really doing this or we're not doing that. But when you put the facts together, it's hard to say that they're not going to weigh more heavily on one side or the other. So let's go into the NFT world. And I'm very, very cautious about getting into the NFT debate right now, in part because, the NFT space needs a little bit more time to sort of sort itself out. But, when you start looking at NFTs, there are different buckets that you can put those NFTs into. And
oh, yeah. I mean, like, at what point of time, right? That's like, they're different. They are changing, so everything what's happening is, it's happening, right?
And it's powerful technology. And very early on, this is going back to 2 years ago. I love somebody who came out with the exploding NFT. And when it was an ERC 721, I think it was, that had embedded in it a ERC 20 token. And so you bought it as an NFT, but then you could basically push the button or pull the cord or whatever you do, and it would explode into your own token offering. And so how do you clarify that? Another one, and these are from early days of crypto, is that, one relatively famous, at least digital artist, who was one of those that was putting out, you were buying an NFT and you were buying, a unique piece of digital art. And there were, of that series, there were 2,000 or there were 10,000, and each one of them was a little bit different. So each one was unique. Oh, well, then he put together a project, and sold each one of them. There were 10,000 pieces, I believe, that he sold for $2,000 a piece. And he called the project currency. So if you think about it, if you're going to call something currency, is that going to make it feel like currency? If the idea is that you can go into a market afterwards and every one of them is going to have a $2,000, they're basically not going to be non-fungible. They're really, really very fungible. Raises some interesting issues of where we are on that spectrum. So bottom line is we've got a sliding scale here. And the question is, how far in one direction or the other are you with it? And then don't forget to add the currency piece in.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at some famous artists who did NFTs, right? So let me just see. So we have. So
as you're looking, I'll in my mind,
Canadian
the way
artist Dion von Zim of Audley Oak Tree. A couple of others, Murat Pak. So do we need to be worried about them? Because you see what I mean?
Art's a special world, but the problem with the NFTs is that people very quickly saw that was a good fundraising opportunity. It was a good way to get into the market, raise some money.
Yeah, if this is fundraising, that's something that it's immediately rising, and like I don't see meaningful explanation for NFT being a mechanism for fundraising, right? That's, I couldn't find this, in my creative mind, so that's something that it's definitely a way. But otherwise, it's an interesting area to be in at the moment in terms of NFTs, because right now there could be a risk that in 5 years' time, CFTC or whoever, right, it's going to be after you, and you will not be able to fundraise. You will not be able to fundraise in the traditional equity way, right? You will not be able to sell the business because there's attached security risk, right, or CFTC risk, and this is very dangerous for the entire ecosystem, right?
Well, and this is something that companies need to consider now, and this is a kind of conversation that I have with lots of companies, is that the SEC, the CFTC, certainly FinCEN, the Department of Justice, none of these agencies in the United States, and we certainly see it elsewhere in the world, are reacting immediately, or even in a very short time frame, which, when you've got technology that's moving as quickly as this technology is, it would be helpful to have a more rapid response mechanism, because people don't understand, when you've got a FinCEN order that comes out in 2020 based on activity in 2012. It's very hard for people to draw the lines. But I always say that these agencies have long memories. They go back in time. They expect compliance from the beginning. And if you don't have those pieces in place, eventually when it catches up, you're going to be exposed. Just like we started our conversation talking about Binance, is that Binance, if it is found to need to have been registered and has been registered for 5 years, and it hasn't been doing the compliance it should have as a registered entity 5 years ago, that's 5 years of violation that are out on the table. And every day, every year of violation is real money in terms of fines.
Of course, 100%, but okay, so we had first the issue with Binance, right? SEC versus Binance. That's something which I said, okay, this is basically US playing, other jurisdictions, right? But then we saw Coinbase, right? And then I said, okay, this is interesting, because that's again, going after US entity, key players, and between Binance and Coinbase, I think we have 90% of trading is actually done with by those two entities. Majority of this being, Binance. And then we have, CBDC under attack, and the projects under attack. So that's something that immediately in the industry you could start hearing, oh, that's, you either go with the traditional financial institution or you've gone from the market. That's the bottom line, which is, kind of the feeling, What's your view on this? Is it like you either, be with JP Morgan or, BlackRock, or you simply don't trade, and you could be subsidiary of, right? That's fine. But otherwise you are in big troubles.
Well, I think the question is, can you trade with the more traditional organizations in this asset or these asset classes? Because we really are talking about multiple asset classes.
Yeah.
And certainly the more traditional entities are building the infrastructure for these asset classes, but we're not quite there yet. I think that, the bottom line is that, the regulators have said for a long time that these rules apply to this new space. There's actually a very interesting piece that Preston Byrne, who is a U.S. lawyer and has been very much involved in crypto projects over the last several years. He put a piece out on a Tuesday morning, and in there he had a comment that I really haven't seen anywhere else, and that may be my own fault for not having been reading enough. But he said that what's happened in the U.S. is that the U.S. policymakers were willing to give crypto some time, thinking if this is going to be the next internet, give it time to play itself out. But because, with the passage of time, it hasn't proven to be the killer app that it was anticipated to be, it's now time to bring it into compliance.
Okay, interesting view.
It's a very interesting perspective, and it's one I want to explore further. Right. But that we've been talking about this for a long time. I've been on the speaking circuit for 10 plus years now, telling the crypto space that laws apply, and it hasn't been a popular message. And
that's to say the least, that's definitely.
I know
how many projects I spoke with, and I'm like, with DeFi, we completely decentralized. There's, 5 people running the project, from the tech perspective, but we are completely decentralized. What
Right.
do you mean running the project?
The best we can do, and certainly you're doing it with the technology solutions, is be working to put pieces in place so that there is protection. And it may not be entirely clear yet what's going to happen in the NFT world. I think you and I both have a pretty good idea of how that's going to play out. And just make sure that people, are taking steps now. Part of it's collecting enough information. I mean, not collecting customer information. Well, it's an anathema to crypto generally, and it's an anathema in the NFT world. It's absolutely central. Sanctions laws apply worldwide. And you can't do a good job complying with sanctions laws unless you have a better idea of who your customer is. And then when you start to move into these other areas where there may be additional regulatory overlay, and even if there isn't an overlay, a lot of countries like the US have statutes in place that say that, you're not supposed to be involved in money laundering, you're not supposed to be aiding and abetting, you're not supposed to be willfully blind to it. And that means you need to have a lot of the same kinds of systems in place. So you know who your customer is. You can monitor that customer activity. You can have a pretty good sense of what's happening with your platform.
Yeah, but you can argue that, and we both know these arguments in the NFT space, right? That, it's like if you sell, I don't know, books over internet, you don't have to do KYC on whoever is buying, right? This is, so why do you treat other commodity, which is, NFT? It's not financial asset, it's not, art per se, for example, where you have, AML rules applicable. So you see what I mean? It's like, and you have probably you have 100 lawyers who would say 100% AML is, AML rules are not applicable. You don't have to do KYC. I mean, it's simply do whatever you want in terms of data collection, and payments, receiving payment in crypto. As long as you stay with crypto and you don't do fiat, that's completely fine. Or you probably can do fiat as well, because that's like selling books. So that you see, it's like it's a gradual, where can someone draw the line and say, right, we are at risk? And I completely get it.
So, but the best retort on that is, especially when they say, "Well, our lawyer said we can't do it," and you say, "Do you have that in writing from your lawyers?" Because someday they're going to want to go back into their files and say, "We asked that question of our lawyers, and our lawyers told us we didn't have to do anything." And that's why I say in the U.S. we do have a federal criminal statute that applies to all U.S. persons. And that federal criminal statute is pretty darn clear, and it can be the basis for prosecuting, anyone. And I'll give you an example. PayPal, a lot of people don't realize this, but the PayPal had a deferred prosecution agreement with the Department of Justice back in 2002 or 2003, before it was really, and they were prosecuted, or the conversations were under federal criminal statutes, not under the money service business rules, which they have become subject to over the years. But what they were doing is their payment system was being used for online gambling, which was, against the law in the U.S. And it came under a money laundering statute that they could be prosecuted under. If you look at eBay, if you look at Amazon, they don't publicize what they do, but they do have compliance programs in place. They're keeping an eye on who their customers are, what's happening business wise.
They don't do KYC, that's something that, they don't do. You do some sort of analysis, right? But this is far from, identifying whether you have someone buying books who is on the sanction list.
Oh, they're doing sanctions list checking. There's no question about that. If you're somebody who's
maybe
on
in terms of IP, not in terms of, names.
Well, what they do catch is, and this is where it's a little bit different in the case of Amazon and even eBay, there are shipping addresses that are attached. So they have an idea of where those documents are going. But we've got some interesting cases in the sanctions world against business models like this, where I'll have to go back and pull it because I don't want to misspeak on who it was recently, within the last 2 years or so, paid a fine to OFAC, sanctions violation, because it was an online order that was shipped to a particular location with the intent that it was going to be shipped on to Iran. And there was apparently enough information in that chain that they could figure that piece out. So they have other kinds of pieces of information they're able to pull in, and lots of AI probably generated data about their customer bases that they can use to try to protect themselves. Is it 100%? They got into, I know Amazon in particular, this is fairly well documented, had issues around the counterfeiting. So they've had to put a lot of pieces in place to make sure their systems aren't being used by people who are counterfeiting.
This is 2 years ago, right? Which they were actually forced to do something, and you can still, buy, counterfeited goods, on at least on eBay. This is what's factually, correct. So that's something which you still can do, and how you can prevent this. It's gonna be really difficult. What about, the asset? I mean, there's another piece which is very interesting, is the asset freeze on, on Binance assets. I mean, there's going to be, I'm sure 100% that, blockchain analytics companies are, jumping up and down, happy because, there's going to be a lot of tracing, a lot of budget, whatever you can recover, we're going to pay for you. I mean, you to do this, all this stuff. So definitely, but it's a, there's, if we say that all assets traded by Binance should be under the security law. So all of them are actually securities which are legal. So all the assets are, supposed to be frozen at some point, right? So there's 80% of the market in terms of Bitcoin, right? So where is the end of this?
I think there are a number of people who are still scratching their head 3 days later, in terms of what the implications are around the order. And I have to say, I've spent a fair amount. It's not an order; it's a request to the court. And to be honest, I don't know whether there's been any action taken on it yet.
Right.
What I think they're trying to do, and reading through the request, is to try to prevent an FTX type of debacle where you start to see the assets go off into different directions, and they start to pull it back. And because of the fact, if in fact the allegations, there are a lot of allegations. So until we get further into this process, it's important for us to say these are allegations; these are not actual facts. That there's a lot of allegations around, who owns what, and that ultimately a lot of the assets have been put into a kind of position that it ultimately could go back to the single person owner. And what they want to protect against is that single person owner and the companies he controls from being able to glob onto customer funds. So it's a preventive measure. It's also, there's something very interesting about this case, is that the Southern District of New York has been the one that has been most active in bringing crypto cases to date. Most of the big crypto cases, the SEC has gone in through the Southern District of New York. This case was filed in the District of Columbia.
Exactly.
And again, another interesting piece around this is that the CFTC case against Binance was filed out of Chicago. But the fact that this is being filed in DC and this asset freeze order is being filed in DC makes me think that we're getting closer to a DOJ case.
Right.
And because some of the more interesting cases in the crypto world involving, sort of true criminality have come out of DC. And part of the reason is that the Department of Justice it's a real quirk of U.S. law. So I don't want to go down the rabbit
exactly.
hole.
So what's explain, very quickly what's the DOJ, and how it's different than, SEC and FinCEN in this concept. I mean, because not everyone is so familiar with the quite complex structure of the U.S. regulators.
The DOJ is. And this is where it does get complicated. So, it's not easy to necessarily draw all the lines very boldly. But the Department of Justice is the principal overseer of the criminal statutes. And a lot of those criminal statutes they also oversee a lot of civil statutes as well that apply to customer behavior or to one's behavior. So they've got their own jurisdiction. They've got their own set of laws that they're responsible for. The SEC comes along and it has jurisdiction over this special category of securities laws. Within those securities laws, there are actually both civil and criminal enforcement provisions in it. So the SEC could bring, usually what they would bring in as a prosecutor, the Department of Justice, they want to allege a criminal violation of the securities laws. Right now, they're just still in the civil, alleging civil violations, right, not criminal. The DOJ is the one, when it comes to the really heavy duty criminal stuff, comes into play. But there's a really interesting quirk that I'm watching for to see if they're going to take it. They're setting themselves up to use it, and that's why they're in the District of Columbia. So it's just Carol looking at reading some of the tea leaves out there and seeing how the tea.
Do you have popcorn and Coke? Like how do you watch this? Because or it's actually quite frightening for you, or you enjoying what's happening.
No, I've seen the play before. That's why I'm wondering if they're using the same playbook that they've used in other cases.
So what would be? I mean, what would be this? What time was similar to this time, like in terms of the whole regulatory versus entities is playing out.
I'm drawing from a couple of different scenarios. Obviously, we've got the FTX scenario that's playing out in New York, right, and that one was not as sort of what's happening is the regulators are having to react, regulators, Department of Justice and so on, to circumstances as they're happening, unfolding. Usually we have a lot of buildup to cases, and that's clearly the situation with Binance. There's a lot of buildup. There's been years of work that have gone into these documents. So, the fact that, that the SEC did what they did on Monday with Binance, on Tuesday with Coinbase, it was a 167-page document that was filed on Monday with the court. The Binance freeze order on Tuesday was another 67-page document. The Coinbase document was 101 pages, something to that effect. And these were well-written, well-constructed documents. Yeah. So there's a lot of thought that's gone into it. So, so going back to your question of what have we seen in the past of it, I would go back to 2008 with the e-gold case, the gold-backed digital currency system that got prosecuted. And a number of sort of similarities in cases, not clear what laws and regulations apply.
How this pan out, how this ended actually,
Well, in the e-gold case, what they did is the Department of Justice relied upon sort of the money transmitter laws in D.C., right, where the Department of Justice has a unique power because D.C. is not a state, that they can go in and do what they want to in interpreting state law. And they went in and said, to e-gold, you violated state law by not being appropriately licensed. I could see very easily with the cases being set up with Binance is that Binance US undertook a process of getting appropriately regulated. But what's been clearly established in the SEC documents, I say clearly, it's been alleged, significantly alleged in the SEC documents, is that Binance Global has been touching U.S. residents. It's not the Binance US, it's the Binance Global that's still been touching U.S. residents. And if they can even establish there's one person in DC, they can then come in and use this DC law and say, you've been violating DC law, and that's a federal crime. And it becomes their gotcha to open the whole world of anti-money laundering laws against Binance. So it's and they've used this in a couple of other cases. Helix, I think, is the most recent one that they did. As I said, I've seen this before, and that's one of the things I'm watching for carefully.
How they end up, the creators of eGold, what happened to them?
That's another subject for an entire podcast. But what I will say is, at the end of the day, the judge, when she was sentencing them, they ended up in a plea agreement with the Department of Justice.
Right.
It was a criminal plea agreement. But when they had to go before the judge for sentencing, the judge said, "I don't believe that you actually did anything illegal, I don't believe you're criminals, and I don't believe the system's illegal." But what her comment is that you put a system out there that ended up being so good for the criminals that you had an obligation under our laws to really sort of pull that system back and put controls around it.
Okay.
And controls to prevent the criminals from using it. Yeah. And you didn't do it. And that's what your crime was. And it's been heartbreaking for me to watch the fact that those principles established in that case haven't really been applied in the crypto space. And at the same time, they can't get a review of their case using the principles that have been used in the crypto space.
Final question from my side. So we have MiCA regulations right now in Europe, right? And that's something that, there's a lot of business coming out from this. I speak, to so many, to my surprise, because, I think it's not like particularly good piece of legislation, all this stuff. But at the same time, I see, interesting businesses coming out from this. What would be your view? Is there any risk, when you issue and, tokens, let's say, and you're completely compliant with the, European regulations, and suddenly you have the US exposure because it's peer-to-peer transaction, like people can go wherever they want and they can, trade on DEXs, which are, for some reason attached to the US soil, like all this different stuff. And suddenly you're ending up being exposed to the US. And it's very difficult to prevent this in the digital, in the crypto, in the peer-to-peer world, right? So, what's your view on this? Would you take this risk or not? Is there any risk, or we simply say that's all right?
I guess I've been one of those that I've listened closely to people in the crypto space that have said, "Well, we're going to leave the U.S." And I'm like, "What are you leaving the U.S. for?" We're leaving because there's clarity in other countries. Well, what does that clarity really mean? Is it really going to be better, that clarity in another jurisdiction? Or are you just trading you're trading what's going on in the US for, quote, clarity, which is actually going to be as stringent, if not more stringent in the expectations of what one has to do. And if, you're thinking about going to Europe because you think that, that you're going to have greater clarity, well, you're still going to have to do KYC. You're going to have to do transaction monitoring. You're going to have to do all those things that, guess what? That's just what we've been asking for in the US for a long time.
I guess the difference is, and that's like the conversation which is happening now as we speak, it's like almost, is this criminal activity in the given country? Can I go to jail because of this, right? Even if what's the certainty around, if I do everything by the book, how lawyers would advise me to do it? What's my personal exposure that, these things will be understood differently at the given point of time. So this is the risk. And, like the conversation is happening weirdly, for me is like, is there extradition law, between those countries and the US, right? And what's the extradition practice, which is really bizarre to do when you have people who wants to do proper business, right? But these are the considerations.
Yeah, well, and these are huge questions. I think one thing that the crypto space doesn't necessarily totally understand, I think Michael Groniger from Chainalysis did a interview recently that their system, and I know that some of the other blockchain analytics systems are being used by governments around the world. He said that their systems being used by 200 agencies in 50 countries. 50 countries. Apparently the
that's
IRS.
A claim, that's a claim. I want to see the numbers. Who's.
I know. I get that piece, and I've talked to competitors on that point, and I understand. However, those numbers sort of coincide with the SEC post. As the ICO's activity in 2017 was really kicking up, the SEC started to bring together securities regulators in different countries. And at one point, they had up to 48, I think it was, regulators. I think that number's north of 48 country regulators. So you've got a lot of international cooperation that's already happening in this space.
Not enough. I don't think it's actually enough, And I was in Barcelona when, there's, Joey Garcia ran the panel with the regulators, right? And there's like Philippines, Thailand, like this region. And they said that there's zero cooperation with the SEC, zero. So that's something which is
Thailand. Interesting.
Yeah. So that's something which is, very bizarre, I would say.
We have seen in some of the biggest takedowns of crypto firms in the last several years, BTC being one and some others, they have been multi-jurisdictional. Mm-hmm. And we've seen, I think BTC, there may have been as many as 12 countries that are involved in that action. Yeah. We're definitely seeing more coordination on these actions on a global basis. I mean, it takes time. You know how long it's taken for the bank regulators to get together, and they have a much, in a lot of ways, their tasks are a lot easier than what's facing the crypto regulators.
Carl, thank you very much for this. That's been extensive conversation on what's happening in the US and in the global market. Thank you very much for this.
As always, great fun. Thank you for having me, Paweł.
Crypto Compliance, brought to you by Gatenox.